national conferences that are taking place. The next one is scheduled for October 25th in Seattle, Washington, and that will be at NCLC's annual Consumer Rights Litigation Conference. If you're interested in registering, there still is space, and as soon as I stop talking, I will include a link to the registration so that if you're interested, you can look into that. We also do a number of webinars. Today's is one of those. We offer individualized technical assistance, so case problem-solving technical assistance around issues where consumer rights are intersecting with domestic violence. And we provide a whole bunch of online resources that can be found on our website. And the last piece is building partnerships, pilots, and technical assistance. So we have already embarked on a process of trying to identify some gaps and opportunities for building partnerships between domestic violence and consumer law advocates. If you want to learn any more about all of these things or perhaps other things, you can visit our website, which is listed at the bottom of this slide, or you can shoot us an email. So without further ado, I'd just like to turn today's webinar over to Laura Russell and Persis Yu.
Hi, so my name is Laura Russell, and we're going to get started today with credit reporting issues for domestic violence survivors. So I want to get started on the next slide with today's agenda. Today we're going to be discussing reasons to check a credit report, as well as concerns that survivors may have regarding their credit report. What exactly are credit reports, how to get them, how to read them, how to dispute them, and of course how to rebuild them so that people can get a better credit score and thus be able to get additional things in their lives, such as an apartment, which is always necessary. So we have a poll to begin with, and it's how familiar are you with your credit reports? And I believe in the chat box we're going to be able to answer. If you could just click on the answer A, B, C, D, or E, and we'll give it a few minutes. I will say while we're polling that though I do love my web browser opens to annualcreditreport.com, even I and probably Persis do not have this do not do this on our credit reports, and though we probably both check our own credit reports as well as our clients' credit reports, we're not on annualcreditreport.com every day. So I think the poll is going to close very soon. Okay, and so a lot of people didn't answer, but some people do actually occasionally review their own credit report. Unfortunately, no one's reviewing their client's credit reports, but hopefully by the end of today's session, that will change.
I just want to pipe up, and so that folks are clear that on the right-hand column where it says there should be something that pops up that says polling. It's actually below the chat box. So just so we know for kind of the next opportunity, folks can find it there.
So why check your credit report? Well, there are financial reasons as well as safety reasons. Your credit report is a very telling document about not only what you're accessing and purchasing, but what other people may be accessing of your history, financial history and otherwise, as well as purchasing under your name. So financial reasons to check your credit report. All your credit cards access your credit report prior to giving you credit or during the time that you're seeking additional credit. So a credit report that is accurate, or as accurate as it's going to get, is one of the best mechanisms to check your fiscal ability to get money, to get finances, to get an apartment, to get your cell phone contract renewed, to get insurance. Landlords now access and have been accessing credit reports for tenant screening, and they're not just looking to see if someone hasn't paid past rent. They're also looking to see whether someone is delinquent on other charges, whether they're not paying their credit cards, whether they've paid the utilities up to date. You obviously have to have a good credit score to obtain a mortgage, but such things even as car insurance rates are based on your credit report and your credit score. So you could be given a much higher car insurance rate just by having a lower credit score. You can obviously not be getting credit based on your credit score. You may not get a cell phone based on your credit score. As a matter of fact, sometimes they'll even check your credit score if you're in a medical facility and you're seeking to pay and you don't have medical insurance if it's not a emergency treatment. So there are many financial reasons to check your credit report and to make sure it's accurate and to make sure your client's credit report is accurate. And of course, the least of which is also that it is possible that there could be identity theft going on. Many times in a domestic violence relationship, as we probably all know, the batterer will make sure that the survivor has very limited access to funds by doing such things as not only not giving them access to bank accounts or ATMs or savings accounts, but also by doing things such as ruining their own credit. So getting all the credit cards put into the survivor's name even though the abuser has access to everything, and putting all the assets into the abuser's name. And what this does is this lowers a person's credit ability to get further credit, as well as lowering their credit score. And then when the survivor leaves the batterer, you stop paying the credit cards, mostly because one is not able to pay the credit cards. And so then you go into delinquency status and you could get sued. So these are very, very important reasons that anyone who's working with survivors needs to check their credit reports, as well as identity theft, which is just when a batterer will just take someone's identity or information and use it to create credit cards that the survivor has no idea of. It is very easy to get a credit card online illegally if you have just even the smallest of information from someone. Most of our clients in a relationship, their batterer has this much information from them: their name, address, social security number, and maybe their mother's maiden name and a salary. That little bit of information will allow the batterer online to illegally get credit cards, cell phone contracts, utility contracts in the survivor's name. And then what happens is the survivor doesn't even know they exist, and when they separate, the survivor is left with all this debt, and usually doesn't find out about the debt until after there's a judgment, and they're already garnishing the survivor's wages or attempting to garnish the survivor's wages. So some security risks that one can identify on a credit report include things as joint accounts. If someone has a joint account with their batterer, it's likely that the batterer will be able to access any additional information with regard to that account. The current address and phone number is listed on a credit report. So if you call a credit reporting agency and ask to have a credit report sent to a certain address, that address will appear on a credit report. You can also check what we call impermissible pulls, which are agencies or places that have pulled your credit report, and that's listed usually on the last page of a credit. And the reason we would say they're impermissible is also because sometimes it is part of identity theft. So the batterer is looking to get more credit cards, and so they're making applications with various credit companies, and those credit companies are then pulling the information on a credit report. There are other ways to get a pull on a credit report. If someone is authorized to pull the credit report, that will show up on a credit report, as well as Another thing to be careful about, especially when our clients have to change Social Security numbers or change their name, is that many times the current and former identities are easily matched on a credit report, so that the information regarding the new address, the old address, the new name, the old name, get mixed into the same credit report and are easily pulled and shown when you're looking at a credit report. So some of the concerns specifically for domestic violence survivors, some of which I've touched on already, is that many of the abusers will keep all the assets in their names and the debts in the victims' names. One of the unforeseen good things that has come out of the 2007 mortgage crisis is that many times now, whereas it used to be you could get a mortgage in one name and a deed in the other name, now they're actually matching the mortgage to the deed. So now we're actually seeing more clients who own the property that they have the debt on, which can be helpful to the survivor who has the mortgage in her name. So abusers can easily track whereabouts basically by using ATM usage or credit card usage or banking habits. So if your client has an ATM card and the batter has access to that account, they can easily find out where they are, what shelter they may be relocated to. So your client needs to be very, very careful about that. Also, keystroke software is very common nowadays. People install it, and basically what it is it's installed in the keyboard, usually in the residence, and any time you type in information on that keyboard, it's stored into a file into the computer, and it can be accessed. So if you can see the history of where somebody's been on the internet and match it with the keystrokes, you can find out all the passwords to various accounts. We talked about illegally obtaining credit cards. Like I said, it's very easy nowadays with the internet to get a credit card illegally in a victim's name. And, you know, other things and concerns for our clients is that many times assets are kept in family members' names, especially if one's married, so that they feel that if they're kept, and rightfully so, if they're kept in a family member's name, that it will be near impossible in a divorce to get any entitlement or any right to any piece of that property. And abusers also frequently file false income tax returns using the victim's names. This is done whether they're married or not. Again, with the internet and e-filing, you don't need a signature to file an income tax return. You really just need some backup documentation, such as a W-2. A lot of our clients are entitled to things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Care Credit, and many of their deductions zero out their taxes. So clients need to be very, very careful about checking and making sure whether their income tax returns have been filed without their knowledge, which would be illegal. One of the easiest mechanisms to do this is to go on the IRS.gov website, and you can order a tax transcript or the tax return itself for I believe it's 3 to 4 years back at this point, and you can do this online, and you can see if any taxes have been filed using one's Social Security number. So, and these are just some of the concerns that are specific to our clients when they're separating from a domestic violence relationship, because our clients really have to be very careful, especially if they're going into shelter, that they're not able to be tracked and that they're able to be hidden when they need to be hidden. So I'm now going to turn it over to Persis, who is going to discuss a credit report.
Thanks, Laura. I'm like they said, I'm Persis Yu. I'm a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center. I realize that many of you on the webinar probably don't know who the National Consumer Law Center is. So we do advocate for low-income consumers specifically, both on national and state levels. One of the other things we do is we provide a series of publications Probably most relevantly, we do have a consumer's guide for domestic violence survivors. And for those of you that really want to get into the nitty-gritty of credit reporting, we have a manual on all the ins and outs of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, too. So to get started, really the first place to go is to what is a credit report. You know, a number of you indicated that you check your own credit report from time to time, and that's great. So you have a sense of what it is, but what is it really? What is a legal term? Credit reports are actually a colloquial term for what is legally defined as a consumer report. And a consumer report is any kind of report. It can be written, oral, it can be transmitted electronically, but it is something that has bearing on a consumer's creditworthiness, their credit standing, their capacity, their character, their general reputation, personal characteristics, or mode of living. So you can see that that's not just what is your credit card history. It goes beyond that. So it may have information about what community are you living in. In some types of consumer reports, there might actually be interviews with people. Or there are other types of consumer reports that talk about theft in stores, shoplifting, for example. So those are examples of what is in a consumer report. And the ways that consumer reports are used are either for credit or insurance, for employment, which actually, I don't know if that was mentioned earlier, but it is important to note that credit reports are used for employment purposes now. And I think about 50% of employers say that at least for some of their employees, they are checking their credit. So that's another reason to pay attention to your client's credit reports. And then there's the catch-all, which is any necessary business purpose, which is pretty broad, and it gets as far as some dating sites have been able to say that they have a permissible purpose because people want to know the creditworthiness of their potential mate or whatever. So that's a pretty broad definition of, what can be contained and who can use the credit report, or the consumer report as it's more accurately called. So who are the consumer reporting agencies? There's the big three. These are the guys that we think of all the time: Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. And usually when people think about, I'm going to get my credit report, they're talking about getting one from one of these places. If you're going to go to annualcreditreport.com, which I will talk to about a little bit more in a minute, but those are the guys that you're going to get. But they're not the only players in the industry. So there are some that will do reports just for mortgages. Innovis is a good example of this. And what they actually do is they actually compile a lot of information from a lot of different credit reports and put it into one. But if you're getting a mortgage, this is likely the broker who will provide the credit reports to your mortgage broker or to the bank. There are some companies that do specifically employment reports. LexisNexis does this, HireRight does this. There's a whole host of other folks that do it too, but those are probably the biggest two. There's check services, so if you've ever bounced a check, it's very likely that the bank will have told this telecheck or Certegy that you've bounced a check, and if you go to open another banking account, they're going to pull one of these kind of reports, and that's why you might get denied a bank account. And there are literally hundreds and thousands of other smaller-based consumer reporting agencies, especially with the availability of big data on the internet, data mining. You have lots of guys who, if all they need is a computer and an internet access, and they can set up their own consumer reporting agency. But for the most part, what we're going to be talking about today is the big three. They are, for the most part, who your clients will certainly encounter. You may encounter the other ones, but you will definitely encounter the big three. So I think a point of extreme confusion amongst consumers is the difference between the credit score and their credit report. This is an easy mistake to make because we have a lot of emphasis of credit scores in the media. We have commercials telling you that you need to check your credit score. We have, Susie Orman and all those other financial folks saying you need to be on top of your credit score. And so it causes a lot of confusion about what is the difference between your score and your report. And the report is really the information. And that's, from my perspective, what we really want to make sure to check and to make sure it's accurate. The score is just a mathematical number that is generated to determine whether you are likely to default in some type of situation. FICO is the company that most creditors use to determine that, but the others do exist. Vantage is probably the second largest and is taking up a larger portion of the market share these days. The thing that's really important to know about the credit scores is that lots of people want to know what their credit score is, and unfortunately you are not one number. There are many, many, many different formulas that even just FICO uses, for example. So if you're going to apply for a car loan, they're actually going to apply a different formula than they're going to apply than they're going to use if you apply for a credit card, for example, or a mortgage, because they're looking at different things. A person is less likely, or whether somebody defaults on a credit card is not necessarily going to determine whether they default on a mortgage. Some people will prioritize debts in a certain way, and they actually have taken that all into account when they've created these mathematical formulas. So that's why it's really important to make sure that the information is correct. The information that this score will be based upon is what we want to know is correct at any given moment. Your score will vary. You can buy scores, but they are actually just educational scores. They're going to be an estimate of what your score is. And so in general, I tend to advise against purchasing your score unless you have an immediate need to know where you are. But again, it's important to know that it's just an educational estimate about where you might be if you're going to apply for credit soon. So Laura talked a bit about impermissible purposes. So under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, there are reasons why people can pull your credit report. If you're applying for credit, for example, if you're applying for insurance, these are permissible reasons to pull your credit report. There is also the general catch-all with your permission. But there are impermissible uses and ways that are not legitimate for pulling somebody's credit report. If you are engaged in litigation and would like to know what the other party's financial situation is, that's not a legitimate reason for pulling a credit report. If you'd like to know if, investigative purposes, such as trying to see if they're hiding assets in certain places, that's not permissible. And especially getting reports on your family members, spouses, other relatives, family, friends, that's not permitted under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Unfortunately, what you'll see in especially domestic violence situations is that abusers will often have the information that's necessary to pull a credit report on you. So if they were to go through annualcreditreport.com or one of the other many places where you can purchase a credit report, they probably have enough information to get that data. So it will show, as Laura said, where you're living, what bank accounts you have. If you're using a local bank, then it will show that you're in a certain area. So these are impermissible reasons why people will pull your report, but it does happen. So it's important to keep that in mind. So this is your right to see your own credit report. Under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, you do have a right to see what's in what's called your consumer file. You are entitled to get that for free once per year from every nationwide consumer reporting agency. Now, it's important to know when you get your credit report from annualcreditreport.com, you're not actually going to see the exact same report that's going to be given to a lender or, a landlord if they're going to pull your credit report. It looks a little bit different. So, for example, when you go to get your credit report, You have to answer a lot of questions, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But they use a very sophisticated matching criteria to make sure that the information that they're going to give you is your information. Unfortunately, when creditors go to pull credit reports, they don't have as much information, so the matching criteria is looser. So there may actually be more information on your credit report when you go to apply for credit than you're going to get when you get the consumer file. There are other times, other than your just automatic one free report per year, that you're entitled to a free report. If you're the victim of identity theft, you also have a right to see one if you have had any adverse action taken on you based upon your credit report. So that's denial of credit or denial of a lease or something along those lines. And then also if you're unemployed or if you're on public benefits, you can write to the Consumer Reporting Agency and say, this condition exists for me, I'm on Social Security or I'm on the state public benefits, so can you please give me a copy of my credit report? And they have to do that. So how do you get the report? And how do you do so safely? You know, the main way that people get their credit report is through annualcreditreport.com, or that's the main way we suggest people get their credit report, because that is the one that is sponsored by the FTC, and it is completely free. It is not free with catches, but it does have some pitfalls to it. So one of the pitfalls is that it does have pretty challenging identifying questions. And in my experience, they tend to be questions that low-income folks have a very hard time answering. So I've had a number of people who have been rejected from trying to get their credit reports online. The other thing is if somebody has been the victim of identity theft, they may just not possess the information to answer these questions, because they tend to be questions that will be regarding what's already on your credit report. So if you have no idea what accounts have been opened up in your name, you're probably not going to be able to answer the questions. There are other ways that you can get the information, such as either sending in a form that you can get off the website or having your client call. But it is also important, as Laura said, to get the report safely, because any address that you give when you request the report will have that address then reported on there. So if there is a chance that you suspect that an abuser may be trying to get the credit report, you want to make sure that the address you give is one that will not, you know, put your client in jeopardy. So annualcreditreport.com does only provide access to the big three. The other CRAs, you can, some of the bigger ones like LexisNexis, you'll probably be able to go on their website and they may have a form for you to get the credit report that way. But otherwise, you also have the ability just to pick up the phone and they'll ask maybe for some identifying information, and then they do have to give you the report. So what is required of the consumer reporting agencies when it comes to the accuracy of your report? So under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, consumer reporting agencies are required to follow reasonable procedures to assure the maximum possible accuracy of the information. So this is not a very strict standard. The requirement is not that everything be exactly perfect. The requirement is that they have to be reasonable in trying to make sure that things are as accurate as possible. It is a balancing test between Congress decided that it was important that this information be available and not too onerous, so that you wouldn't have consumer reporting agencies, but that there are some consumer protections. One thing that we've seen is there are systematic problems with the way that consumer reporting agencies gather their data, and like I was talking about before, and how they present it to creditors, that actually we think jeopardizes the accuracy of credit reports. And one thing that is also important to know is that if Bank of America provides a consumer reporting agency with information on a credit report, they are generally allowed to presume that it's accurate until they have reason to believe that it's not. So they're not going to question things beforehand. And so then in terms of accuracy, obviously one of the biggest problems is going to be identity theft. So Laura went over some ways that identity theft happens. You know, for this population, probably the most common is that the abuser or some other person knows the consumer's identity, has their personal information, is able to use that to open accounts. It also happens because of stolen information. There are data breaches with the big banks, or by sorting through people's mail, going through the trash at, say, retail outlets where they have those credit card receipts. So those are other ways that people are able to get identity. So what do you do in the identity theft situation is that the first thing you want to do, if you can do so safely, is to file an identity theft report. You can do that with the police, the post office, the FTC. Sometimes it comes down to who actually will take the report. Unfortunately, the police are not as cooperative as we always would like them to be about identity theft issues. Some precincts are obviously much better than others, but in some locations it is quite frustrating to get the identity theft report with the police. So if that's not possible, they can legally be filed with any law enforcement agency. So once you have that report, you can dispute the charges with the creditor. You can put either a fraud alert or security freeze on your credit report, which alerts the credit report that you have identity theft issues and can limit the access that other people have to your report. So this last point that I have on the slide is about merged accounts. And so it's often worth mentioning when we talk about identity theft that sometimes things wind up on credit reports, not for malicious reasons, but because of poor matching criteria. So that is, you know, I had one client who I'll call Beth Smith, and she lived a mile down the road from somebody called Eliza Smith. And so because their identifying information was so similar, the information wound up becoming one report. And so unfortunately, Eliza Smith had terrible credit, and that made Beth Smith very unhappy. And so she thought she was a victim of identity theft, and it just happened that the accounts got merged. So if someone is the victim of identity theft, there are some requirements on the consumer reporting agencies to try to protect their identity. And one of the ways that that can happen is through blocking. And so a consumer can request that the consumer reporting agency block the information that they say is fraudulent. The things that they have to do that is they have to be able to prove their own identity. They have to be able to provide a copy of the identity theft report. So again, that can be a challenge because working with law enforcement, and it's also a challenge, you know, if there are reasons why you can't report the identity theft, certainly. So the consumer has to be able to point to the account that he or she believes is fraudulent, and he or she has to make a statement that the information does not relate to any transaction by the consumer. So that would mean, you know, even if the consumer didn't open the credit card account, but maybe the consumer used it. So that would be an example where maybe they didn't authorize the opening of the account in their name, but if they did benefit from it, then they probably couldn't get the information blocked. The CRAs do sometimes deny it. They, you know, because they don't want everyone to claim that everything is identity theft. So they can deny it if they have reason to believe that it's erroneous or that the consumer is making misrepresentations or did actually benefit from the account. there is a lot of litigation back and forth about when they can do that, but they do have an out there as well. So another thing to note is that while there is a lot of identity theft, there's also just a lot of regular errors on credit reports. And I do think that it's worth mentioning, just so that you know, if you do get a credit report and everything's not right, nefarious identity theft reasons are not the only reason why that might be there. Unfortunately, credit reports do have a very high rate of inaccuracy. There are several studies that have shown that it's probably about 1 in 4 consumers who has a serious error on their credit report. And in some of my own research, it suggested that for low-income consumers, that percentage is actually even higher. So there are other things to look out for, too, that the consumer reporting agencies do mess up on their own from time to time without any other intervening forces. So, you know, there are a lot of things to consider when looking at the credit reports. But some other times when common errors do come up is when debts are either there's a change in the servicer or it's been sold. Credit card debt happens. That happens with credit card debt all the time. Old credit card debts that have been purchased by debt collectors may appear to be newer than they actually are. There's also, you may just find accounts that are completely unidentifiable, you know, with creditor names that are just a garble of letters, like I've talked about, the joint accounts, merged files, and then settled accounts. If someone has settled an account with a debt collector, very often the settlement does not get reported, or it gets reported incorrectly in some way. So what you want to do if you do have an error on your credit report and are able to do so safely is dispute the error with consumer reporting agencies. You will find good examples of dispute letters on myfaircredit.com, a number of other websites as well. You want to emphasize that you want to dispute the data in writing. The consumer reporting agencies really want you to use their website to dispute the information. But unfortunately, if you do that, there's very little record on your end of the dispute, and you can't attach anything that way. So if you have reams and reams of bank account information that you have to show that whatever is there shouldn't be there, you know, copies of promissory notes that have a signature that looks nothing like your client's, you're not able to attach that if you use their website. So that's why, you know, we always recommend in writing certified mail. It's important to include the, you know, full name, address, social security number, and detailed information about the disputed item, because the consumer reporting agency can reject it without that. Any supporting documentation that you have, and they do have, you know, they have to look at the information and respond within 30 days. The quality of which they do, you know, varies and often is not what we want it to be, but it's important to at least go through the steps in order to protect, because it will protect your client down the road too if she does follow all of these steps. Now, the logical thing when you see something's wrong is to go directly to the creditor. And we are suggesting that you do a dispute with the creditor as well, but there's actually some awkward legal step work that you have to do, because under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, you actually don't have a right to enforce the provisions that require creditors to deal with disputes. But you do have a right to enforce the provisions which require creditors to handle disputes that come from the consumer reporting agencies. So what will happen is when you file a dispute with a consumer reporting agency, they're gonna go back to the creditor and they're gonna say, hey, the consumer disputes this information. Is it correct or not? And they're going to have to, they have to respond one way or the other. And whether or not they do a reasonable inquiry on their end is going to be actionable on what they send back. And it's kind of awkward. But so what you want to do in order to preserve those rights is if you're going to send a dispute to the Consumer Reporting Agency, just send an exact same copy to the creditor. That way, you're both alerting them to the fact that the information is incorrect, but you're also alerting them to the fact that you've provided the Consumer Reporting Agency with this information, and so that's the information that they're going to have to use when they do the reinvestigation back to the Consumer Reporting Agency. So like with the other ones, we send it certified, keep copies. You can also request that they prove or validate the debt too. Just because you're not going to protect your legal rights doesn't mean you don't have the right to request other things and that it wouldn't be a good idea. And then depending on what kind of account it is, there may be other legal protections to ensure the accuracy of it. So with that, I'm actually going to turn, sorry.
Oh, thanks, Persis. This is Erica, and I just wanted to take this chance before we move on to the next set of slides to share some of the questions that folks have sent over to us, and maybe Laura and Persis, you can give your perspective on these. So we have one that asks, can people still obtain their credit report even if they have a credit freeze on their credit?
So the quick answer to that is, well, yes, you can, but it is much harder. So you would have to go directly through the Consumer Reporting Agency to get it. You're not going to be able to get it on annualcreditreport.com. The reason why is because when you put the freeze in place, you're really alerting them to the fact that there's a high likelihood that someone's going to try to take to get this without your permission. And so with the freeze in place, that creates a lot of roadblocks, which is what we want, except for that it does then make it harder for you to get your own as well. So in that case, you would have to contact them directly, and they would probably, I've seen them ask for a lot more documentation. So typically, they may just ask for a copy of a driver's license and maybe, a bill that shows that you have an address that corresponds with the report, but they may ask for additional information in that situation.
Also, you need to be careful because they may ask for an address, and you want to be careful about any address you give them because it's going to appear on your credit report already. So if you have to give them an address, you want to give them an address that the abuser would already know, like a friend or relative's house that he already knows the address of. So you're not giving him any additional information.
And you can also use P.O. boxes too.
Yes.
Okay. Another question. A recent client allowed her abuser to use her information to open up several credit cards. They signed an unnotarized agreement saying he would pay her back, but never did. I was unsure how to help her since he had her permission. What can she and I do?
So this is an identity theft. This isn't stealing. This is what is now being termed coerced debt, which is she probably allowed him under a lot of duress and possibly because of the domestic violence relationship in the relationship. So an unnotarized agreement in most courts is not going to be permissible evidence. But what she can do is if she gets all the credit card statements, if she shows that he's used the card and she shows that they're his purchases, assuming it's a man, then she can go to, after she pays the debt. Now this is the other problem. She has to show the outlay of money to pay the debt. She can then go to her local district court or civil court and sue him for the money back. Or if she's being sued in the in civil court by the credit card company, she could what we call implead or bring him into that action. And for anything she pays, he would be liable. Unfortunately, I don't, and Persis, I think would agree with me that there's no direct way for her to say to the credit card companies, this isn't my debt, I'm not paying for it, and actually in a court of law win that argument.
Yeah, I think that's right, unfortunately.
So are there other non-legal remedies that you can think of that could, help somebody in that situation?
I mean, obviously she needs to cancel the credit cards. Obviously she needs to change all the passwords. But unfortunately, canceling the credit card will also trigger, if he is repaying, will trigger the entire amount being due and owing. She may realize that she's going to be sued, possibly, and so she needs to precaution herself that if she is sued and they get a judgment, first of all, they might send it to an old address, so she might not even know she has a judgment. And judgments can take 10% of your gross salary as well as bank accounts. So she might want to start protecting herself in that way. The other thing is if she has the financial means, is she could, after she cancels the card and it eventually will go into a collection status, she can try to negotiate a payout plan. Many times when cards are in collection status, you could pay much less than 100% of the debt in exchange for getting rid of the debt. But those are, unfortunately, the only options I can think of.
Great. Okay. Somebody else asks, and I'll share this with you, but we may want to save it for after the next set of slides. I'll leave it up to you. Any special tips for effective advocacy on behalf of clients when credit reporting agencies and creditors often want to deal directly with the client?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that is incredibly frustrating as someone who works with clients with credit reporting a lot. So generally, a release or an authorization should provide you with the legal right to speak on behalf of your client. And for creditors, that usually works. But, I mean, you do need to have that release with the client's signature, notarized if possible. But that should be sufficient for most creditors. Unfortunately, I have not found that to be sufficient for the consumer reporting agencies, and they have uniformly required every single time I've tried a power of attorney, which, I'm not sure that that's legally required, but I've never been able to get around it. So typically what I do in that situation is I do keep the client, have the client talk to them if on speakerphone, if possible, with me in the room. And that's been the way that I've been able to get around that for that perspective. For debt collectors, I never want my clients talking to debt collectors because they will talk them out of their food stamps and rent payments. So I am very insistent that, the authorization that they have for me to, represent them is sufficient, that they do not need to talk to my clients.
Okay, and then the other one is just a language thing. Somebody asked what you guys meant when you were talking about something as being charged off.
Sure. Charged off is it's a banking term, and so legally, creditors after a certain period of time of not receiving payment are not allowed to keep a debt on their list of assets on their financial books. So charged off is a time when they take that asset, that debt, from being an asset on their books to being something that they have then charged off. And so they're still allowed to collect on it after that point, but in terms of when they do their reporting requirements to their regulators and to their investors, they're no longer able to say that that is a asset which they expect to collect on. And so at that point, so when it reaches that point, your credit report will say that it's been charged off, and it'll reflect that it'll become more negative, I guess, at that point in terms of your credit score. And that is also typically around the time when then they'll send it to collections as well.
Also, charged off for them many times means that they've taken a tax deduction for the write-off of the non-payment of the debt. So they've already determined in their tax books that they're not going to get paid for this. It doesn't really, again, it doesn't affect the consumer, but it is something where they've already taken a deduction in their earnings and charged this off. So there was another question about whether pulling your credit report actually is a problem and affects your credit score. When an individual pulls their own credit reports, such as through annualcreditreport.com, it does not affect your score. That's a common myth. When you continually request credit, and places like Chase and Citibank and PNC are asking for your credit, that can affect your credit score. But when you are pulling your own credit report, that does not asking the score, just getting the report, that does not affect your credit score.
Okay, great. Thanks everybody for your questions, and Laura and Persis for your answers. I think we're going to turn back to the presentation now.
So I want to talk a little bit about rebuilding one's credit report safely, and obviously this also means increasing one's score. So there's a lot of things to consider when you are looking to rebuild, when one is looking to rebuild their credit score. The first thing is for our clients is safety, of course. And the reason I say doing this safely is because, again, anything that you're going to do new is going to be put on your credit report. So if you want to have your credit report reflect that you took out a new credit card and that new credit card has your new address, that new address will turn up on your credit report. So you can either think about a P.O. box for all your bills, recognizing, of course, that the P.O. box may be close to where you actually live, which if you've moved to a different state will cause anyone who pulls your credit report to see what state you're in. But some of the ways you can rebuild your credit safely is doing such thing as obtaining a secure credit card from a bank. The one that I see the most when I can't sleep at 2 a.m. is the Green Dot secured credit card. Chase, I know, has one too. Basically what a secured credit card is just you give a company $500 and they give you what is a credit card for a $500 limit, so it's a collateral. You don't go over the amount of money they have in the bank for you, and so it's collateralized, which means that they're not going to lose anything by giving you this card. You can ask your landlord or utility companies or cell phone companies to report your current rent payments and that you're continually reporting. They continually report on your credit report that you're paying your rent on time. There are several pitfalls to this. Obviously, the first one is the address issue. The second one is in a pitfall. It's that small landlords are not going to do this. They don't have the time, and they usually don't. They're not required by law to do this. So if you're with a big landlord company or a corporation, then they may do this, but most small landlords will not. You can obtain a store charge card. Store charge cards are much easier to come by these days than credit cards. And then now I'm not saying go out and get 15 store charge cards, but get 1 or 2 store charge cards. And with all your credit cards, you want to keep the credit balances low. Your credit report and your credit score look at not only how much money you could in one day spend if you have a shopping spree, but also how much money you owe to a credit company as compared to what the balance is. So if you owe $4,000 and you have a high limit of, or the amount of the credit of $4,500, that's not as good as if you owe $4,000 but you can actually take out $15,000. And with all your credit cards, store cards, what you want to do is at least use each of them once a month, and then if possible, pay that amount back in the next month. So in actuality, you're keeping either a zero balance or a very low balance, but you do want to use them for small purchases monthly, and that also helps. And again, keep the amount of the credit you can take out to 80% of the balance being the amount of the total amount. So paying your bills on time is very important. And also remember that having no credit is worse than having bad credit. So someone who has absolutely no credit history whatsoever will have a more difficult time getting credit than someone who has bad credit and is trying to rebuild their credit. There are credit cards out there that specialize in rebuilding credit. They have higher fees, they have higher interest rates, they have annual fees, and they have very low balances, but they can be very helpful for people who have bad credit and are looking to reestablish credit. So a lot of this we talked about in rebuilding your report safely. Again, all personal information becomes part of a credit report. Anyone who knows your information can illegally access your credit report. It is, again, very, very easy to access a credit report. Always obtain your, when you obtain your credit report online, that's the best way because it doesn't give them an address, but if you have to, you should give a P.O. box address, again, where an address abuser knows. You can apply for credit using a P.O. box. And of course, don't give phone numbers to creditors or credit agencies. And be careful because locations can be discovered not just through exact addresses, but through area codes, zip codes, or access points, again, such as even a corporate landlord that has its headquarters in New York and has all its buildings in New York will, if they're reporting, they will alert someone who's monitoring your credit illegally to the point that you are now living in New York. So sometimes it's better not to rebuild your credit at all. Something else I want to talk a little bit about is under the new regulations, when you are applying for a credit card, they're asking what your actual income is. So if you're in a relationship or a household, or you're married and you're a stay-at-home person and you're not earning an income outside of the house, you need to be careful because you may be denied credit because of the fact that all the income in the house is not something you've earned. They are looking at changing this, but right now one of the negative consequences of some of the new credit laws is the fact that people who don't have their own income are being denied access to credit cards, even though the household income can easily support the credit card. So preventative measures, we've talked about a lot of these: choosing a billing address or P.O. box, having a security freeze. Some states do have laws that require CRAs, which are your credit reporting agencies, to place a freeze for free in case of domestic violence or identity theft. You can also put a fraud alert on your credit report. This will make it very difficult to get new credit, both the security freeze and the fraud alert. You will have to jump through, as Persis talked about, additional hoops if you're looking to rebuild your credit with these freezes on. So that's something that your client has to take into consideration, whether she wants to do both at the same time or whether she doesn't want to focus on rebuilding her credit, she wants to focus on freezing her account. And when you're changing one's identity, you need to be very, very careful. The CRAs are notorious for merging old and new identities, regardless of Social Security number, and name change or just name change. So something also to consider when your clients come to you and they owe money is that there are differences in debts. There's differences when parties are married versus non-married, when they have separate debts, joint debts, and they're authorized users on credit cards. So, for example, Sometimes a client may just be an authorized user, and they may not actually be liable for the debt. So, and we'll talk about that on the next 2 slides. So married versus non-married. When parties are married, all the debts that are accumulated during a marriage can be considered marital debt, which means that both parties are liable for the debt in the divorce case, regardless of whose name is on the debt. Plus, debts for necessary expenses such as medical care or food are the liability of both spouses. And in the past, though many credit card companies did not go after the other spouse who did not sign or use the credit card for a necessary expense, sometimes now we're seeing that more and more they're going after people for these debts. So clients who are married need to consider whether a divorce might be the best option for them, because the debt can be distributed in the divorce, and possibly a higher percentage of the debt can be paid by the batterer, who might be the moneyed spouse. Now remember that divorce law and consumer law are very different, and they don't always match up. So in many states, if you have a divorce decree that says, for example, the husband should pay 100% of the credit card, even if the credit card is in the name of the wife, that means that the wife will still be liable in a consumer court or a civil court, but she can go after her husband in the divorce, or the husband should be paying it through the divorce. So when you do have issues like that, you need to make your client aware of what she may or may not still be liable for, whether it's in the divorce or in civil court. So if parties are not married, the account holder or the one that signed the agreement is the only one that's liable for the debt. So if a former partner is only an authorized user, then they're not liable for the charges. Only the account holder is liable for the charges. And there's no right for the creditor to sue an authorized user. They sue the actual person who signed the agreement. Now that being said, what that means is that whatever the authorized user spends, the account holder is liable for, because they are given free access by giving a card with an authorized user. If you look at a regular credit card, you will not be able to tell if it's an authorized user credit card or if it's a account holder's credit card. That's something you either need to see from the statement or from calling the credit card company themselves. So joint debtors or co-borrowers, they sign the contract to borrow, or the creditor's contract jointly. They're both equally liable. It's called joint and several liability. They're both equally liable for 100% of the debt. Authorized users we just talked about, they are allowed to use the account. They're not liable for the account. So account holders are liable for the account. So that's something that clients also need to be very careful of. I start every time when I talk to clients by saying don't ever co-sign anything, and I don't just mean that in a relationship with domestic violence, but I do mean that in anything, because when you co-sign something, you're 100% liable for that debt, and clients do need to be careful of that. When you give someone an authorized user card, you are 100% liable, and so people need to be very, very careful about that. So when you start to think about separating one's credit from a former partner, you really need to conduct a safety analysis, because anything you do could cause a letter to be sent to the former partner, the batterer, could cause the batterer, if the batterer's card is declined, the batterer can get angry. If you're not in a safe place, the consequences that could flow could be horrific. So clients need to think about putting a red flag on your credit report that says that the credit reporting agency cannot release your credit report without authorization. Canceling a joint credit card, again, that means that the entire amount on the credit card becomes due and owing. So clients need to, and it will alert the other user to the fact that the credit card has been canceled. So they need to be careful about what's the right timing to do that. The same with authorized user accounts. It's also a good idea sometimes to cancel credit cards that are known to the abuser, because if they have enough information, they can illegally obtain authorized use or use the credit card illegally, pretending to be the account holder. Many times they can just transfer balances. So once you cancel a credit card, the amount is due and owing, but you can transfer a balance to another credit card if you have that financial capability, and then the other credit card is not known to the abuser. Everyone needs to, as have their clients review all their contracts, bank accounts, insurance policies, cell phone contracts. They need to make sure that they're all in just the one name. They need to make sure that they're only carrying their client cell phone charges, insurance policies, beneficiaries. Many times if people are married, they might forget about beneficiaries, and there was actually a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court about who was entitled to a employer beneficiary life insurance policy, whether it was spouse number 1, who he was divorced from, or spouse number 2, because he had failed to change the beneficiary on his account, and spouse number 1 won. So it's changing your credit card companies, changing your banks. I do recommend changing banks. I know that sometimes people get used to one bank, or they may only have 1 or 2 banks local in their area, but it is very easy once you have the name of one bank to try to access information. So, and of course reviewing your credit report and changing all your passwords. So these are a lot of steps to take, and so a lot of times when you are talking to clients, you want to break it down. You want to start with the most important, which is the credit report, the joint credit cards, the joint accounts, and eventually move into the other stuff. It may take several months to actually get all the contracts and the beneficiaries changed, but it is something that clients do need to consider. So,
okay, great. Before we delve into this scenario, I just wanted to, there are a couple of questions that had come up while you were talking, Laura. So one person just is asking about, you had recommended that, well, why shouldn't a consumer give a phone number to a creditor or agency? What about for purposes of fraud alerts?
Fraud alerts are different. I mean, if you need to give it for a fraud alert, that's fine. You have to give it for fraud alert. But if Capital One calls you up and says, "Oh, and by the way, what's your phone number?" They're going to use that phone number. They're going to put it in their paperwork. It may make it onto a credit report. It's going to be used to access not only when you're delinquent on accounts or when your account's due, it may be used to try to sell you things. So I don't recommend it, just like I don't recommend giving telemarketers your phone number. There's too many uses that they can have for it. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then someone else asks, are there any credit issues that are particularly relevant or problematic for undocumented immigrant survivors of domestic violence?
Well, there's two issues here. There's immigrant survivors of domestic violence who have immigration status and have a Social Security number, because, of course, everything here is going to apply to them, just as it would anyone who's not an immigrant or is a U.S. citizen. Immigrants who do not have a Social Security number and are using an ITIN, they still need to be very careful, because a lot of companies will still give credit cards to people regardless of if they just have an ITIN. And it's something they definitely need to be careful of. You can also file taxes with an ITIN, and so a lot of times you'll see taxes being filed fraudulently, and if someone is applying for immigration status, filing taxes and getting taxes back and paying taxes is extremely important on the immigration applications. So clients do need to care and take note of what taxes have been filed based on their ITIN. So.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that too is that generally, this is not specific to immigrant survivors, but generally within the immigration population, because a lot of folks do have to carry a lot more identifying information, carry papers. You know, identity theft is extremely prevalent with immigrant populations, and so, you know, being very careful with the papers and being very vigilant when they've gone missing is the other thing that I'd point out.
The other concern that I've had with a few of my clients are clients that have Social Security numbers that are not obtained properly. And so if you have a fraudulent Social Security number, whereas some of our clients will eventually give up and have to file bankruptcy, with a fraudulent Social Security number, you can't, because that would be filing fraudulent documents with federal courts, which is not treated very well. And so I have clients who purchased a Social Security number. It wasn't theirs. They're utilizing it. They've amassed a ton of debt in their name, but they now have no way out because they are they didn't get that Social Security number legitimately, and so they do have to pay that debt back. And even if they don't have that Social Security number legitimately, they're still going to be sued, and they're still going to owe money. And if they do own anything, that can be attached. So that's a bankruptcy is not an option for people who do not, have the right Social Security numbers. So.
And there's one other question, Erica, that I think might have come just privately to me. So there is also a question, what would be some examples of the hard identifying questions that I had mentioned earlier? And so sometimes the questions will relate specifically to questions about the accounts on your credit report. So they may ask, what is your car payment amount? What is your mortgage payment amount? What is your overall balance on a certain account? They will ask about very old things. So, they will ask about things that might have happened 5 or 6 years ago. And then they also ask trick questions very often, which trip up a lot of people. I know, they will ask questions about, in 1982, you purchased what car? And it will list, then like Rolls-Royce, Mercedes-Benz, Datsun, or none of the above. And most often it's none of the above, but it confuses people to no end, because they're like, why would they think that? For a lot of the people, a lot of younger people I work with, they go, I was 10 years old at the time. I didn't buy a car. But they often have trick questions where the answer is none of the above, but they don't. A lot of people just get kind of hung up on them, and it'll kick you out and then not let you try again.
A question that was asked before. Sorry, a question that was asked before was how big of a player is the CHEX system, C-H-E-X? And I've actually never run across them, but I do believe they're pretty big in certain markets. Persis, have you run across the CHEX systems?
Yeah, I mean there are definitely some banks use them more than others, and unfortunately I don't have a rundown of which ones are being used, but it definitely does come up fairly frequently, as that people will say, hey, I was randomly denied for a bank account because of some old bounce check from 5 years ago, and unfortunately it is hard to know which banks do use the other ones. But if you do kind of a Google search for checking account reporting agencies or screening companies, you can kind of come up with a list, and you are, like with any consumer reporting agency, able to get any information that they have on you. All right, so should we move on to the scenario now?
Yep.
Yeah,
okay.
That sounds great.
Great. So we have a little scenario to hopefully get you a little bit more engaged with this. I'm going to read through the scenario, and we do have a multiple choice question coming up first. But while we're going through that question, I want to also get people thinking about how would you deal with the situation, because we would like to have just a couple brief moments for folks on the line to kind of give us some feedback about what they would do in the situation too. So that's kind of to tee it up. But so the scenario is that Rebecca and her husband Richard are in the process of obtaining a divorce. Richard handled all of the finances for the family and did not keep Rebecca informed. Rebecca knows that her husband has opened accounts in her name, but is unsure of what was opened, when, or if he paid them off. As part of the divorce settlement, Richard has agreed to assume responsibility for all of the debts. Lately, Rebecca has been getting a lot of collection calls and letters. Which of the following accounts is Rebecca responsible for? Oh. Laura, can you move it over one? Thanks. So here is a snapshot of Rebecca's credit report. I'm going to give you a couple moments to look this over. Think about, well, which accounts is she going to be liable for? You know, we have the information that she doesn't know about them. And in the divorce, Richard said he'd take over all of them, but still looking at these three accounts, in what we've talked about today, which one are she going to be legally on the hook for if the creditor were to come after her and sue her? So I'll give you just another 10 seconds, and then there's going to be a poll that's going to be on the side. So which one of these is she going to be liable for? A, none of them, B, all of them, or C, the Ocwen and the Dell. And so I think our poll is closing soon. Okay, so it looks like of the folks who answered, most people answered B, all of them. And so that is a very tempting answer, but the answer is going to be C and D. Is C, Ocwen and Dell. And the reason why is if you want to look here, we can see the party who's responsible, and it's going to be on the right side of the credit report. So you're going to see under the Ocwen, it's going to say that there's joint responsibility, so they're both responsible. For Chase, she's only an authorized user. So that's why she's not actually legally liable for the account. And then we see the Dell, she's individually responsible for the account, and so that is why she would be on the hook for that debt. All right, so now we're going to have a more discussion-based question that will be led by Laura.
Okay. We should all be seeing the slide that says Rebecca has never heard of the Dell account before. She believes that Richard opened the Dell account to purchase computers for his failed startup business. What is the first thing Rebecca should do? Sorry.
And so if anybody would like to answer this question, if you take a look under the participants panel, on the left-hand side, there should be a little hand icon. And if you click on that, we'll see it, and you can raise your hand, and we'll open you up on the line. Okay, so I'm going to unmute Amy Box. Amy, are you there?
I'm here.
Great. Go ahead.
I would guess file a complaint.
Okay. Who would you be filing a complaint with?
Well, she thinks it was, he did it as identity theft with law enforcement and the FTC.
Okay, that's good. That's excellent. That's the first thing. So prior to that, of course, Rebecca needs to be careful about safety issues. She needs to make sure that by filing that, even though she is divorced, that she won't have any problems with him, and that either there isn't a protective order in place, or that she doesn't think that he will hurt her in any way. So does anyone have any other ideas as to what else Rebecca should do?
I'm opening up Crystal Schatz's line. Crystal, are you there?
I am. She just answered what I was going to say.
Oh, okay.
And then I would dispute it, of course, with whichever credit report she had pulled.
Okay. The other thing you want to do if Rebecca's comfortable doing this is to call Dell and get all the paperwork and to find out what's going on with this account. Now, it is likely, since they charged it off, that they will not be receptive to getting her any of the documentation, but she still is entitled to that documentation, and she should be asking for that documentation. Another thing she can think of, if she does get the documentation, is to reopen the divorce on a fraud theory, and then make sure that in the divorce he's listed as having to pay all these debts. And of course, finally, she may want to think, since he's done this, that he may have done or will do other things. So she may want to think about a fraud alert, as well as might want to pull all her credit reports to see if there are any other accounts listed on any of her other credit reports. So this may or may not be the only thing that Richard's done, but usually they do more than one thing, identity theft. So she may definitely want to be careful about making sure that if this is it, she stops it, and if there are more, she makes sure that all those are stopped too. So, okay, so we've come to the end. We're up to questions. I know we did take questions before, but I'm not sure if other people have any other questions. So I'll give them a few seconds to type in. And while I'm typing, I did see that Tamia mentioned that she should write a letter and keep a copy of the letter. And yeah, the one thing that we didn't mention throughout this whole thing is that whatever you send to anyone, you make a copy of. Whoever you speak to, you get their name or their number, because they're not going to give you their real name. And you know when you spoke to them and for how long you were on the phone. You want to have a clear record of everything that happened, so that if you do need to do anything in the future, you have a document for everything that existed. So, are there any other questions? Okay, here's a question. Why would an account show up on a credit report if you're only an authorized user, since you're not liable for it? A credit report doesn't always have just what you're liable for. It has what you've used. So if you've used that credit card, it will show up on a credit report. And it can affect your score, even though it shouldn't, because you're not liable for it. But yes, under FICO, it will show up as debt and will affect your credit score. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'll add is that your credit report is really intended to be somewhat of a comprehensive overview of not just, what you might be on the hook for now, but your entire spending payment history. And so, you know, if you are an authorized user on a card that has a very high balance, there is an assumption that you are also, you know, part of the reason why that balance is high.
I recognize that it is just 3:30, so we're going to answer the one more question, which is, should you remove all settled debt from your credit report? I don't believe it's possible to remove settled debt from your credit report. Things stay on your credit report for 7 or 10 years, so I would not think that you could remove settled debt. Persis, have you ever been able to remove settled debt?
No, I mean, the only way that, you know, settled debt can be removed from the credit report is if you're able to negotiate that in the settlement. You know, a creditor does have the ability to remove items from your credit report, but they're not necessarily required to. And if you know, just as a matter of accuracy, if you have a settled debt on your credit report, as long as it's, you know, less than 7 years, it does have, a credit reporting agency does not have to take it off.
Great. Well, this is Erica. It looks like we are at the end of our time. I want to give a huge thanks to Laura and Persis for sharing all this really incredible information with us today, and for everybody for rolling up your sleeves and participating in the thinking throughout the hour and a half. I'm going to, earlier I shared some information about our upcoming conference. I'm also going to share our website and contact information. And then, of course, on this last slide, Laura and Persis were generous enough to share their contact information directly. So we do hope to hear from you all as you go about doing this advocacy with your clients. Thank you very much, and have a really wonderful day.
Thank you.